Chapter 71. Koda's remaining forces marched through the long mountain pass, knowing the journey would last 2 days. Despite sending an extra day in Stonewall, Koda's men were not revitalized enough to start another trek, or even less so for a battle at the end of that trek. The mountain pass was a narrow stretch of road that sliced through a single mountain. A set of high rock-faced walls bordered the road, and wind rushed through the makeshift valley with its cool autumn's air. Wicker and Elisa marched behind the train of troops, watching its rear. Wicker was still very tired. Leading Arrow and acting as a military advisor had taken its toll on his body and mind. His eyes drooped, and his movements sloshed. His joints creaked stiffly as he trudged along. "You should get some rest. There are a few wagons not too far ahead. No one would look down on you if you hitched a ride," softly spoke Elisa. Wicker jolted his head in a quick shake to wake up. He sleepily smiled at the shadow elf. "I always treated you like dirt, but you've been nothing but kind to me." Elisa paused before responding. "I was a prisoner in the past. I've killed many and caused much strife to many others. I would treat me like dirt too." "You've changed so much, Elisa. Do you know that?" Wicker asked. He rapped his scabbard with his thumb while trying to choose his words. "It's like you're one of us now. No, it's not that. It's more like ever since you and Averin were together, you've been trying to make things right." "Averin," said Elisa faintly, still pained at his loss. "You've gone above and beyond to show me that you really cared for him. I think I was too upset with myself to see that." Wicker swallowed his shame hard. "I'm sorry, Elisa. You are a true friend." Elisa smiled gently, blushing up to her ear tips. "You've changed a lot yourself, Wicker. You no longer see Arrow as just some asset. You really care about each and every one of us." Wicker nodded and looked away. "It took a war for me to finally see that the lot of you are my family." "Even Ellicard?" Wicker held silent, not ready to admit he now saw Ellicard as a friend. "Well, someday, perhaps." Elisa sighed. High on one of the stone walls perched Timber and Calsoon. They sat looking down at the marching army, silence filling the gap between them. Finally, Timber spoke up, although seemingly to herself. "My grandmother was a wise wolf shaman. She was very religious and often told me stories of times long ago. She once told me of a story of 5 individuals and the sacrifices they made to vanquish an evil that descended from a new moon." Calsoon turned curiously to his companion, but she did not return his gaze. She continued all the same as she regaled the tale. "Long ago, before, there were no gods. A time where there was only Nihilio. The world had its magic, but only for a select few. Man lived only afraid of the wicked that the shadows brought. At the time, the wicked were ruled by the vampires, and the night was not nearly as frightful as it would soon be. For once, the black moon appeared in the sky, the night would rule. Demons descended from the new moon, and with them brought a war that man would fight for 100 years. At first, man did not fight alone. Following the demons then came angels, skin like gold, wings as pure as pearls. The angels fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed by this menace. Save for 6, the angels retreated from whence they came. The 6 angels were indeed fantastic warriors in their own right, but the demons were greater. It seemed all hope was lost, until Nihilio stepped down from his celestial throne and gifted 5 mortal beings with the power of a second soul. The second souls were of a new magic, a magic created to hunt the demons. Embedded with the souls of the Jade Hawk, these 5 men and women fought back the demons in a final bout. The demons were defeated, but not destroyed. They crept back in their shadows. The 5 Jade warriors vanished, now that their purpose was complete. The 6 angels ascended to become gods. A mortal leader was chosen to ascend with them. Once the new gods were established, they saw Nihilio as their all-father. After 100 years of a brutal war for survival, man found peace again." Calsoon grinned. I've been told that story before, but you tell it so eloquently. Timber finally turned to face Kalsoon. Her eyes were steely, and her face was grim to match. My grandmother told me that the demons still lurk among us. She tells me to watch for anyone with amber eyes that the night shines through like an amber moon. Kalsoon chuckled lightly. Your granny is full of stories. Timber smiled thinly. Perhaps. But stories are always born from a shred of truth. Chapter 72. The gigantic Estinian camp was bustling as Legion and Inlay entered. Soldiers sparred and blacksmiths repaired armor. On the outskirts of the encampment, Legion and Inlay found Veda leading 50 new black rabbits in a kata. They were fresh-faced and of Estinian blood. However, despite being green, they looked well-trained and strong. After all, Estinian soldiers were known as merciless and tenacious in the first place. Now that they trained as black rabbits, they would be a force to be reckoned with. Veda finished her kata and bowed to dismiss them before turning to her high blade and first blade. 50 rabbits trained and ready, my high blade, Veda said, proud of her quick work. Inlay inspected the new rabbits as they walked off. They look a bit rough. Veda winced at the criticism, but made the best of it. They are indeed rough around the edges, but the bones are there. They will do fine in combat. Inlay, report to the king, the Divra, that we have returned and share what we know of Koda's army, said Legion, catching himself. He waited for Inlay to bow and hustle off before pulling Veda off to the side. Veda, there is something we discovered while we were in Stonewall. Go on, said Veda, slightly confused. Avalon is alive and is with Koda's forces. Veda stumbled backward, her jaw slouched open in bewilderment. How can this be? I was sure she was enslaved in the gladiator pits of Scorch. Legion grabbed hold of Veda, shaking her to her senses. Whatever the case may be, can I count on you to finish your mission? Veda furrowed her brow, still taken aback. My mission? To finish off Avalon, Legion snarled. Veda touched her hand to her head. She needed to sit down and reflect on this news, but Legion did not allow her such time. Avalon will fall under my sword, my high blade, said Veda finally. Good. I have no doubt that you two will meet on the battlefield, nodded Legion pleasingly. Veda walked slowly again. She was now focused. She was confident she would see Avalon on the battlefield, but now hoped to meet her before then as well. Koda's army made camp under a large overpass of rock. The Silent One slumbered as Edema conversed quietly with her silver wing across the glow of the dimly lit fire. You know who the first Silent One was? Edema asked Avalon. Not a true question, but a test to begin a conversation. Her long white and orange jacket rested beneath her, serving as a pillow against the boulder. Her pale white skin gleamed in the fire, as did the black veins that seemingly clutched her cheeks, her amber eyes hauntingly cast in the night. Autumn, sister of Judeo, Avalon responded. Do you know why she was the first Silent One? What do you mean? Avalon asked, slightly confused by the question. Edema sat up. I've heard stories about you, Avalon. I've learned about who you were before you dedicated yourself to Judeo's blade. Avalon shifted nervously. Edema shined a toothy smile. No need to worry, dear Avalon. As you can see, a lot of us came from troubled and dark paths. I'm a tainted elf, for example. An elf born with the blood of the night. What have you learned about me, then? Avalon questioned Edema, now more curious. You were once an assassin, one of the best in your clan. You had a sister of sorts, and you were very close. Avalon lowered her head. She had never forgotten about Veda. She thought about her constantly, and it hurt her heart each time her memory surfaced. You left her behind in your old world so that you could ascend to the high honor of being a Silent One. You, Avalon, are Judeo. Your blade sister is Autumn. Separated by an entire world, your sister stayed behind to carry on the work she believed in. One day, you two will be reunited. But unlike Shadeo and Autumn, you will have to make a choice. Adema continued. Avalon widened her eyes with the realization of that choice. The choice of whether you will save Veda or kill her. I pray that you will find the strength to make the right decision. Finished Adema. I need to take a walk, Avalon said as she took her leave from the fire. Avalon wandered far from the sleeping army, deep in a whirlwind of thoughts. What would she do if she had to confront Veda? Blade sister, we must speak, she whispered to herself, unable to clear her head. I'm here, my sister. A voice called from the shadows as a figure dropped from a low-hanging cliff. Startled, Avalon instinctively drew her blade. Peering into the shadows, she whispered to the stranger. Veda, is that really you? Veda approached from the reaching shadows. She placed her hands out so that Avalon could see she was no threat. I see you still wield a blade, like a rabbit. Avalon arched a brow, unable to tell if Veda was here for a fight. Fragment of my past. I doubt I'll ever relearn to fight like anything other than a rabbit, responded Avalon. Avalon, there is a battle on the horizon. You and I will be on opposite sides of the field. We will be enemies, and truthfully, I do not want that. Veda stepped closer to her blade sister. Avalon sheathed her blade and offered her hand. Then come with me, Veda. Become a silent one. We can stand together as we once did. Veda sneered at Avalon's offer. You wished me to forsake my ways. The only path I walk is that of Alana. You, of all people, should know this. Avalon looked at her empty hand and curled it into a fist. She bit her lip in frustration. Ever still the stubborn one, Veda. Once again you stand on the precipice of a new destiny, and you still do not see that the ways of the rabbit are wrong. Veda looked away silently. Avalon continued. I have been in your shoes. I have seen the errors of my ways. Shadeo will save your soul. She will shape you into a warrior of the light. Where Alana turns her back on you, Shadeo will embrace you in her crimson wings. Veda opened her mouth to speak. She could see it herself, dropping the ways of the black rabbit to run and join Avalon. However, she was afraid. Afraid of the clan and afraid of herself. I can't. Avalon, I have to go, stuttered Veda as she leapt back on top of the wall and vanished into the shadows. Avalon watched as her friend disappeared once again. Tears began to swell in her eyes. You are not too far gone, Blade Sister. I will wait for you, she whispered, knowing Veda was not around to hear her. Chapter 73. Koda's army pushed through the morning at a quickened pace and arrived at the Varisian encampment by noon. Koda's forces were relieved to finally get some proper rest and meet up with old friends from distant divisions. Wicker found his father discussing plans with his friend and fellow White Cloak, Petrov. Wicker was hesitant to approach his father, but Petrov nudged Marcus, alerting him of his son's presence. Wicker threw a smart salute. General Nusan, Wicker was broken off by the heavy embrace of a bear hug from his overjoyed father.
Wicker, it is good to see you. I am so happy you survived Stonewall,
Marcus shouted in a booming voice, tears streaming from his eyes.
I heard the reports of what you had to go through. I prayed to Alu for mercy and Jadeo for you to have the strength to pull through.
Wicker blushed, crushed by his father's large arms. Father, not in front of the men. Marcus chuckled, dropping his son.
Right. It's good to see you alive and well, Captain,
he said, finally returning Wicker's salute. Wicker smirked, going in for a hug of his own. I'm happy to see you too, Father. Marcus sat down, pulling a barrel for his son to sit next to him.
Speaking of your men, you must tell me how Arrow turned out.
Wicker flashed a grin. We are the scourge of the Black Rabbits. I've learned much from Ellicott, and I'm inclined to believe I could even beat you in a sparring match. Marcus chortled a belly laugh and slapped his knee.
Well then, I'd like to take you up on that offer once we win this war.
It's real good to see you again, Father, Wicker mused.
Aye, the same to you, my son.
Koda walked into the large war tent set up for the various leaders. There he met up with King Dallin of Varus. The king was about 30, but his face was weathered and his hair was dark with gray sides. He had a well-kept beard that was red at the tips. Despite his age, he looked tired and dreadful, the way a king should when his capital is under siege. The 7 long whispered lords stood conversing around a circular table with a large map of Varus spread on top of it. King Dallin relayed his information to Coda.
Now that you are here, Coda, we can begin this meeting. The Asinians are 3,000 strong. Their forces are well rested and well fed. A stark contrast from my own. We were at siege for weeks with our supply routes cut off from Stonewall. We have the numbers with our forces combined, but my men are in no shape to fight. How are yours?
Coda gulped nervously. I was hoping your men could carry mine to victory. 3 weeks in that forest had left my men just as battered.
The 2 of you have sentenced us to death with your arrogance,
spat Athar. Silence, Moonfall. Athar's negative attitude over the course of the war had ground Coda's patience into a fine powder, and Athar knew this. He was delighted to see Coda's defenses finally giving way.
Coda, your constant foolishness have cost us dearly, pushed Athar.
I said enough, Coda shouted, clearly stressed by a combination of Athar and his own failures as a leader.
You see, my fellow lords, Coda cannot handle the crown. Unlike his father, he is not.
A sharp backhand from Coda reeled Athar backwards. Athar was then lifted into the air with his arms tightly bound to his sides by an invisible force. Athar watched as Coda's hands were raised and shivering. Coda's eyes were menacing as well, and his breathing was labored. Athar's face was pure fear. He clenched his teeth and pushed on defiantly.
I would be a fool to think our king is a coward. But to say that he is drunk with power would be a catastrophic understatement. How can we entrust the realm to such a volatile child?
The other lords gasped and whispered amongst themselves. Coda's eyes darted around the tent before he released Athar from his magi-infused grip. He was in complete shock from his short temper and unforgivable actions. To strike a lord was appalling, but to use the magi against him was unforgivable. He stormed out of the tent, embarrassed and afraid. Dallin ran after him.
Coda, wait,
Dallin called to him. Coda turned, his face tense with tears streaming from his eyes. I don't know what happened. I just lost it. Athar is right. I am not my father, and I am no king. Dallin grabbed Coda's shoulder and lifted his chin. I was the youngest in my family, 4th in line from the throne. I hadn't a care in the world. Coda sniffed and rubbed his eyes. You're making me feel worse. Dallin smiled and continued his story. I had my whole life planned out. I was going to marry my lifelong love and travel the world, but then the Bane blood plague spread through Varus. I lost everyone. I was alone with no family and no mate. At 17, I had to take the throne and lead my nation through a troubling time. Dallin paused as he remembered the painful memories. Coda, I know about the pressures of the throne. I know what it's like to take the crown young. You need to stay strong for your people and yourself. Coda wiped his tears away and nodded. Take some time, and then come back and lead your nation. Coda sat in his private tent with a chessboard between him and Ellicard. The two were locked in an epic duel of wits. Finally, Ellicard moved his knight in place, cornering Coda's king. Checkmate, Ellicard said as he knocked the king over with his knight. Who taught you to be so good? Asked Coda as he reached for a cup of water. My master. He wanted to train my mind as hard as he trained my body. Ellicard picked up the wooden knight piece and felt the grooves that made up its mane. He always said, a blade is only as sharp as the rabbit wielding it. A wise man, Coda nodded, approving the quote. He was like a father. Ellicard started, but halted so as not to offend Coda, whose own father was taken by Ellicard's blade. Coda frowned, but then smiled gently. It's true. You were responsible for my father's death. In all rights, we should be enemies. However, you are my ally now. You serve to protect me and my people. It's funny how life works out sometimes. Ellicard opened his mouth to respond, but quickly stood, watching as the tent flap opened, and in stepped the 7 lords. Athar kicked aside the chessboard to stand in front of Coda.
I see you are with your pet rabbit. No matter, this will be short.
Ellicard sneered behind Athar's back. Coda stood up and put his hand up to calm Ellicard. Athar, what do you want? Athar smirked and turned to the lords. Sove Breeze-Runner stepped forward and spoke up. Coda, we seven have discussed the crown and your future with it. We have come to the decision to elect Athar Moonfall to take your place as the king of Long Whisper. Coda gawked at Sove, floored by the news. How can the seven betray the Dawn Edge? My father forged this nation with his own hands. Athar bobbed his head and chuckled. Your father was a great elf, but you are not your father, nor are you the same caliber of elf. We cannot falter now. We cannot break our binding with such a great battle on the wings of dawn, exclaimed Coda, as he looked desperately into each one of his lord's eyes, finally resting on Cass Baneberry. Even you, Cass. You were my mother's best friend. The Baneberry were the first to support the construction of Lost Dawns. You must still respect the Dawn Edge tribe.
It's not about the respect for the Dawn Edge, Coda. You have driven yourself beyond reason. You are drunk on the Magi. You are blind and unstable and must be relieved of your command, stated Fendrick. Coda stopped. He knew he had lost the crown. He knew he had lost it all. As king, I will make a deal with Auric Stein to salvage the freedom of our country under his guiding rule, said Athar, almost smugly. Ellicard flashed in front of Athar and drew his blade. Shall I kill him, my king? Athar stepped back and shouted in a shrill voice. Keep your rabbit's leash taut, Coda. Lower your weapon, Ellicard. He may speak treason, but only because he is a coward. I speak treason, spouted Athar in mock bafflement. You forget that the same elf by your side slew your father and brought our country to its knees. You let black rabbits into your home. You sent away the white cloaks. You sent us to war ill-prepared. You marched us to our death. And when hope and prosperity presents itself to you, you dismiss it for further destruction. You are unworthy of that crown. Now hand it over. Coda shook his head, hot tears dripping down his face. You can't do this. It's already done, sneered Athar. Coda slowly removed his crown and handed it over to Athar. You utterly failed as a leader, but I will make sure you are spared if you bow to me now, said Athar as he snatched the crown and fit it snugly on his head. Coda trembled, but before he could move, Ellicard put his hand on Coda's chest and faced the lords. Coda will not bow to a traitor. Will none of you five stand by this man's side? The burden he carried was more than the weight of the crown. The war is not over. This upcoming battle will prove that to us. Leave to lick Stein's boots, and Long Whisper will fall. Stand by Coda's side, and we will overcome and triumph, I promise you this. Cass balled her fist and stepped to stand by Coda's side. I cannot carry on with this. Bowing before Stein is wrong. She turned to Coda. I will stand with you, Dawn Edge. I would rather die than serve under a traitor to our nation. Athar snarled in disgust. Very well, Cass. Be the worthless dog I've always known you to be. Athar snapped his fingers and walked out of the tent with his 5 lords following behind. We may have lost an overwhelming number of men, but the Baneberry will fight with honor alongside your men, my king, Cass said reassuringly. Coda lowered his head. To him, he was no longer a king. He had failed himself, his people, and most of all, his father. Chapter 74. Dawn's sun had finally risen, and 2 armies stood on opposite sides of a grassy field. Once an equal number between the two, now Varys' forces were dwarfed by the combined armies of the Estinians and the traitorous forces of the newly deemed king, Athar Moonfall. Coda sat saddled on his riding wolf. Wild Eye was by his side, geared in a lightweight leather armor set. She looked up anxiously and whined. Coda reached over to calm her nerves. I know, girl. This may be our last day together. If that is the case, it was an honor to be your familiar, cooed Coda. Wild Eye rubbed her muzzle against his leg in compliance. Dallin nodded to Coda, signaling him to follow him to the center of the field where Auric and Athar waited. The 4 nobles gripped their leather reins while an uncomfortable silence swirled around them. Finally, Dallin spat on the ground and growled at Athar. Crown doesn't fit you, traitor.
Athar only raised his chin and grinned. Auric gathered Dalin's attention before speaking. King Dalin, I advise you to surrender. Your men are grossly outnumbered now that Long Whisper have come to their senses and turned on you. As Divra, I am merciful and reasonable. I will let you rule Varys under my banner, as I have allowed Athar to rule.
Even sharing the same sun with you and your swine this day is an insult to my men and I. I will see you on the battlefield,
Dalin snapped. Auric looked taken aback by the ruthless insult, but gained his composure. Very well, King Dalin. As you say. The Silent Ones and Arrow knelt in a large circle at the back of the lines. Wicker relayed his plan of action with Avalon and Ellicard as they listened intensely. Auric will no doubt send his rabbits to take down King Dalin. They will easily break through the lines of the chaos of the battle. We need to protect the king. Legion, Inlay, and Veda will lead the Black Rabbits. Together, we three need to intercept them, said Avalon as she nodded at Wicker's assessment. Our boys will form a circle around Dalen and Coda to stave off any rabbits, but we won't last forever, Wicker added. Leave the outer ring to the Silent Ones, Avalon offered. Wicker turned to Ellicard. Ellicard, can I count on you to stay focused? Ellicard flashed an irritated glare, the same glare Wicker knew he was going to receive. Inlay will be there. Are you going to stay focused? Point taken, said Wicker, wincing from the retort. We all have our grudges against these rabbits. They've all caused us great pain, but we must all stay focused. If we stumble, we will fall, Avalon said sternly. Wicker rose and looked at the members of Arrow. Each had tired but ready faces. Each feared the outcome of the imminent battle. Listen up, watchers. Today will be a day of reckoning. We stand at the edge of a battle of insurmountable odds. Our enemy is a god king, and those we once served. He paused, taking a large sigh as he thought about how participating in this battle made him a criminal in his own country. We no longer serve a king. What we once sought to protect, we must now seek to destroy. As you are no longer part of the Long Whisper army, you may turn and walk away now. No one will shame you if you do. Each Arrow member looked at each other and nodded. Rulon spoke up. We are all with you, Wicker. To the end, called out Timber. A large group of men, mostly made of remnants of several units that once belonged to the various lords, surrounded the Arrow members. Blavar looked in disgust. What do you want, Rith? Rith gestured to the various scattered units before speaking. We're no longer whole as an army, which is why we need to stick together now more than ever. You had our backs from the very beginning. Now it's time we had your backs, Arrow. Blavar stood and offered his hand. Rith responded by shaking it. Wicker flashed a joy-filled smile. He looked onward to the Estinian army. They were ready. Chapter 75. May the bards of time and lore sing a song of my fate in this war, a ballad that will not crumble with age, nor its ink fade from the page. Its story will tell of soldiers' blades that clash, fallen warriors taken by angels, wings like ash, and among the chaos of this blood-soaked field, I will forever rest, or a victory shall be sealed. Song of the Soldier. A stillness hung in the air as each and every soldier clenched their teeth in fear and intimidation. The grass waved dazedly in the wind, carefree and unaware of the anarchy that would soon sweep over the field like a giant wave crashing through the forest. Auric raised a single hand from the back of his lines, signaling for a red flag to wave. Immediately, hundreds of arrows could be heard being knotted as they fired into the air like a flock of sparrows flying and careening down on the Varisian forces below. Shields! Dalin shouted as armor moved to raise wooden shields to deflect the shower of arrows. Thunks from the arrowheads piercing and splintering into the shields resounded through the ranks. Another volley, then another pounded down on the now arrow-covered shields. Finally, a new order thundered across the field. Charge! Coda leapt his wolf over the protection of the Arrow and Silent Ones and ran to the Vernal Mages. Quickly, we must disrupt them. In unison, the 6 mages and Coda made an elegant but swift motion with their hands and channeled for the once short grass to grow wildly and capture the charging force in a jungle of choking grass blades. Cavalry toppled over their own horses as infantrymen struggled to chop through the new forest of grass. Coda smiled, pleased with his actions. He turned back to his fellow mages and said, "Lift us up." Once again, Coda and the mages made an intricate dance with their arms, and with an ending upward thrust, pushed gigantic roots from under their own forces and led them high over the tall grass and over the trapped forces. "Attack!" Dallin shouted to the men running from the large roots and jumping down onto the helpless enemy. Furious, Auric called for his catapults to blow through the roots and choking grass, not worried about the amount of his own men he would kill in the process. Coda watched in horror as boulders slick with oil and fire sailed through the air, crashing in a plume of black smoke into the center of both forces. A command from the Varisian forces to fall back rung through the chaos. Fire roared as it spread through the roots and grass. More boulders were released into the skies, this time launching further into the Varisian main forces. Coda channeled magic to spring up massive wooden woven hands to catch one of the boulders, but the rest fell into a destructive impact, sending bodies and limbs flying. "March forward," Auric ordered as his men finally overcame the magically grown obstacles. Soon, they were close enough for another head-on charge. "Prepare to defend," Dallin called out as the Estinian and Long Whisper forces clashed into a full-on battle with the Varisian forces. Coda hurtled alongside Wild Eye over bodies and fighting men, but a bolo tangled his familiar's feet, sending her tumbling across the ground. Coda jumped off his saddle to come to his wolf's aid. A vision of several soldiers charging behind him alerted of the oncoming danger. He swung around and lifted his hand in the air. Emerging roots tangled the bodies of the enemy soldiers with stunning efficiency. Coda quickly untied Wild Eye's legs. Once free, she instantly jumped up to snatch a swordsman's arm within her jaws. The swordsman cried in anguish as she threw him to the ground. Quickly, Wild Eye lunged for the throat of another enemy that came to flank Coda. Coda found himself overwhelmed as he earnestly tried to keep more and more men at bay with serrated leaves and whipping vines, but finally a pike plunged into his side. Wild Eye yelped in pain as she collapsed to the ground. From Coda's side and Wild Eye's side, a red wound seeped blood. Coda roared in agony as he sent the assailant flying with the crack of a vine whip. Marcus and several white cloaks fought hard to reach Coda. "You don't look well, Coda. We need to get you to a medic," yelled Marcus between heavy breaths. Coda gripped Marcus's cloak in pain, hovering his hand over the gaping wound. His palm began to glow a faint cerulean as his wound slowly began to close. Coda grunted through the strain to use the Magi under such a great deal of pain and stress, finally giving up with the halfway closed wound. "Protect me. I need to rest a bit. Then I'll be able to fight more." Marcus smirked. "You heard the elf. Form a ring. Let's get this mage back to tip-top shape." Through the dark smoke created by the great fire, the black rabbits glided through the ranks of the battle, making their way to King Dallin. Under the cloak of low visibility and the chaos of the ensuing battle, the 50 black rabbits quickly made work of the unsuspecting Silent Ones, causing the Arrow members to react in order to protect their Silent One allies from being completely swallowed by the ambush. Their circles were broken. Elicard, Wicker, and Avalon swiftly attempted to join the fray of men. However, they were deterred by a new set of shadowy figures. Legion, Inlay, and Veda intercepted the three, catching them off guard. Legion swiped in a horizontal arc, pushing Elicard away from his companions. Legion chased after him, locking his greatsword with Elicard's own blade. Inlay ran and drop-kicked Wicker sternly into the chest, sending him flying backward. Inlay drew his blade and slowly approached him, a wide grin hidden under his mask. Avalon stood motionlessly facing Veda. "Make your move, sister," smiled Veda. "Without pleasure, Veda," replied Avalon. Avalon ran headlong into Veda, caressing her blade against the grassy ground, ending in a furious slash. Veda dodged to the side and followed through with her own attack, but frowned as Avalon easily parried the strike. Avalon circled around Veda and lunged forward. A quick slice connected into Veda's side. Avalon followed up with a sidekick that sent her blade sister sliding backwards. Enraged, Veda charged forward and leaped over Avalon's head, landing a slash to the Silent One's cheek. As she landed on the other side of Avalon, Veda flipped and kicked off the ground with her feet to boost her speed. Avalon inspected the gash on her cheek with barely enough time to dodge the next attack. Avalon twirled around and slashed at her blade sister's back, landing a gruesome strike. Veda tumbled across the ground, seething in anger. "You can't win, blade sister," spoke Avalon. A hint of sadness trembled in her voice. "The day isn't over," snapped Veda. Avalon sighed before dashing at Veda once more. The two traded strikes with each being blocked before Avalon sidestepped and grabbed Veda by the back of the neck and thrust her knee into Veda's face. A brutal crack let the assassin know her nose was broken. She tried to break free, but Avalon launched her other knee into a heavy blow under Veda's chin. Veda sailed through the air, landing hard on her back. She lay motionless in a complete daze. The side of Avalon's sword slapped her cheek to awaken her from her stupor. "I learned much from the pits. I learned to fight better than you. Much better." Veda tried to scoot backwards to escape her sister's edge, but Avalon held the blame firmly at her throat. "I'm prepared to end this," Avalon continued. "Then end it," spat Veda. "Join me. I will fight you no longer." Veda narrowed her eyes. "Join you or die?" Avalon tossed her blade to the side. "Join me or kill me. I am done fighting you." Veda grabbed her sister's blade and swung it at Avalon, stopping a hair's inch from her throat. She furrowed her brow and snarled. "Damn you, Avalon." She threw the blade away and embraced her long-lost blade sister in a tight hug. "I won't fight you any longer either. I'll join you. I'll join you." Legion swirled his large blade in a Mobius figure, keeping Ellicard at bay before cutting several slashes into Ellicard's chest. Ellicard jumped further backward before dashing into the edged fray. Catching the great sword in mid-swing, Ellicard grunted under its immense weight as he pulled out a dagger from his belt and struck out at Legion's gut. Legion smiled fondly before spinning around Ellicard and slashing at the elf's back with ease. "You haven't been training as hard. A common disadvantage to training the youth." Ellicard growled as he attempted a set of slashes, followed by spinning across the grass on his knee, and jumped up with a ferocious upper slash. The combination of attacks surprised Legion as he desperately avoided the final slashing attack, catching a slice to his armor and chin. "I didn't have a scar there yet. I was wrong. You have grown stronger, my student." "Why do you toy with me?" Ellicard shouted, his voice shaking and tired. Legion unleashed a vicious kick to Ellicard's chest, sending him onto his back. Legion stomped down, cracking Ellicard's ribs. "I don't want you to die here." He looked around, sensing an unworldly power emitting from somewhere in the battlefield. "The tides are about to turn, I can feel it. It's like a force I've never felt before. And it frightens me." "So you're running away? I never known you to be such a coward," spat Ellicard. "If you still wish to finish it all, meet me in the place where it all started," said Legion, before thrusting his sword into Ellicard's thigh. Ellicard screamed as he grabbed his leg in agony. "There will be nowhere you can run, Legion. I will find you." Legion walked away, but called back to his student. "Trust me, I'm not going to run." Wicker dashed angrily at Inlay, slashing savagely at the Shadow Elf. However, Inlay parried before catching Wicker's right wrist. With a flick of his hand, Inlay ruthlessly held Wicker in a painful wrist lock. Inlay moved more pressure onto the now numbing wrist and rendered Wicker to his knees. Inlay smiled. "Little White Cloak is now a red rabbit. My, how the world has changed." "Damn you. I will have my vengeance." Wicker winced. Inlay pulled Wicker's arm forward and drove his sword at his opponent's stomach. But Wicker was quick and grabbed the blade's edge firmly. Wicker grunted under the sharp pain of his slicing hand, but raised his deathly eyes up at Inlay. "Ruining the fun?" sneered Inlay. Wicker stomped a foot into the soil from under him and slowly rose with a rush of strength pumping through his blood. "The fun is just about to begin." Inlay twisted Wicker's wrist, to its breaking point and attempted to thrust his sword into Wicker's stomach again. However, the sword did not budge. Wicker roared as he rammed his shoulder into Inlay, toppling them both and freeing him from the clutches of Inlay's torment. Wicker made sure to move a knee against Inlay's chin. The pressure put the rabbit's face against the ground. Inlay thrashed his hand around wildly, trying to grasp Wicker's red cloak. Wicker grabbed Inlay's arm with both hands and fell to the side, locking Inlay in a straight arm bar. Inlay desperately struggled to free himself, but Wicker mercilessly pressured Inlay's elbow until his arm snapped in the grim hold. Inlay screamed in pain, rolling over to favor his splintered arm. "We are not done yet, clown," Wicker spat as he situated himself on top of Inlay. "No, I think we are done," giggled Inlay half-heartedly as he gestured to the black rabbits now overtaking King Dallin. Wicker watched in horror as the black rabbits pushed back the remaining silent ones and surrounded Arrow, who desperately guarded the king. Wicker looked over to the battlefront to find Estinian reinforcements thundering through the Varisian ranks and powered onward to a sure-sighted victory. "It's over, Red Rabbit," chuckled Inlay. From the fog of the black smoke, 50 black rabbit-trained Estinians rushed the Silent One's lines. Their blades were furious as they overcame the holy warriors. The Silent Ones fought with the force of 20 men each, but these new rabbits were able to adapt to the style of the Judeo Knights. Edema fought hard as she parried and slashed. A set of knives were flung at her side as she retreated back into Arrow's lines. More Estinians rushed her as she struggled to hold her own, eventually falling to one knee. She grunted as sweat stung her eyes under. The immense weight of several swords clashing down upon her was almost too much to bear. A barrage of arrows flew past and relieved her of her own strife as the Watchers sprinted to the aid of the Silent Ones. Elisa somersaulted to Edema's side as she slashed the neck of an oncoming rabbit. She helped Edema to her feet. "I don't think I'll ever get used to fighting those who used to be my allies," huffed Elisa as she spin-kicked a black rabbit off his feet. "I said the same thing when I killed my first demon," said Edema as she inspected her blood-soaked side. "Worry not, silent sister. There are no demons here," said Kalsoon, giving a sly wink. Edema nodded awkwardly, unsure if Kalsoon knew of her lineage. She wobbled on her feet as the pressure of the daggers ached in her side and thigh. She dislodged each knife and focused her silencer until it glowed a bright white. Laying the blade on her wounds, she grimaced as her flesh seared and closed shut. Kalsoon watched curiously while deflecting several attacks around him. Well, that's a useful trick. Elisa rolled over Kalsoon's back, dodging several shurikens. "You two can talk later. We have business to attend to." Edema groaned as she limped back into battle. "The Shadow Elf is right. Enough chatter. Let's get these rabbits cleared from the king." Kalsoon nodded happily. "I suppose we should do that." Timber let loose several close-range shots from her bow as she hopped nimbly from side to side. Behind her, Lear gracefully danced, disarming rabbits and diving forward lethally with his sword. He grunted as one hand held onto his stomach. He frequently checked the hand for any sign of his stitches breaking. Timber glanced behind herself and called to the catfolk. "Essie is going to murder you herself if you keel over now." Lear chuckled. The light threat reminded him of his shameless begging not to be left back in Stonewall. "Fret not, Timber. This Yakati can handle a bit of bleeding." Timber dodged a wayward arrow, leaning backward against Lear so that it would miss him too. "Well, this Yakati better take extra care of himself." Lear kicked away an Estinian soldier. "Cheeky," he replied, amused by Timber's impression of him. Rulon jumped backwards and clattered down his sword against a pair of Estinian attacks as Essie slashed her sword across the two rabbits. She slid back to the side of her brother and wiped her brow. "I miss those days when we followed Trek in the woods all day. This is too stressful," sighed Essie. She looked upon the battlefield and found that despite their hard work, the Estinian forces were still encroaching closely to King Dallin. "Rulon, we may not survive this." Rulon grunted as he locked a rabbit in a headlock before snapping his neck. "Essie, just do your best and watch my back." Essie growled as an Estinian rushed her with a spear. Grabbing the pike with both hands, she leapt backwards and landed hard on the ground. The enemy unsheathed his sword and raised it to strike down on the medic, but fell in a heap as Rulon drove him through. Rulon knelt down next to his shivering sister. Like I was saying, wash my back, and I'll wash yours. All we have is each other now. Essie smirked and reached to flick the tip of her brother's ear. I can live with that. Blavar held the final ranks next to King Dallin, watching as the rabbits continued to push through the two lines of silent ones and watchers. His hands were moist from the sweaty grip of his daggers. His mouth was parched from his crumbling nerves. His heart pounded, still weak from the weeks before. As more and more Estinians broke through the lines, his adrenaline finally overcame his fear. Lunging headlong into the fray, he diced left and right, slicing into necks, arms, legs, and chest of the Estinians. Finally, a slash ripped into his side, bringing him onto his knees. He looked up into the autumn sky, watching as the sun set, perhaps for the last time. However, as he began to faint from the trauma of his wound, a blurred shadow drove a spear into several oncoming Estinians. Blavar collapsed into the shadow's arms. He heard a familiar voice as he began to bleed out. You can die later, Rabbit. The 12th Spearmen are by your side now. Blavar smiled as Rith dragged him to the safety of the medical corps. You glory hounds. Rith chuckled. You got us read like a book, Rabbit. Rest now. Let us have a shot at these guys. Blavar nodded as he laid back to let the medics work on his large wound. Coda, we are being overrun. We need to retreat. Marcus grunted as he pushed away yet another attacker. Bodies piled all around the circle of white cloaks as Coda sat propped up by his familiar, both breathing heavily. This is not how it ends. Not here. Not today. Coda wheezed, exhausted. He struggled to stand, resting one hand on Marcus's shoulder. There's nothing we can do. We're being overwhelmed. We need to retreat. Coda limped past the circle of white cloaks, a large horde of enemies rushing toward him with spears poised forward. Coda was steadfast as he raised his hand outward. It's time I let go, he whispered. A shockwave exploded from the young mage's feet, knocking the rushing soldiers off balance. Coda raised his other arm and pointed away from his side, pulsing an energetic, invisible force that pushed hundreds of enemies in a wave across the ground. This got the attention of Auric and Athar. The two trotted toward the weakened Coda on the backs of their cream-white horses. Athar gingerly approached Coda. What are you doing, Coda? The battle is lost to you. Do what must be done and surrender already. Coda's nose bled profusely. Sweat dripped and soaked into the ground, creating a small puddle at his feet. He was hunched over, bleeding through his now drenched side and down his once vibrant emerald robes. I will not fail my father, Coda murmured, half-conscious now. Athar smirked. It's far too late for that. Coda's eyes snapped open and rolled to the back of his head, unleashing a blood-curdling roar. I will not fail my father! A teal aura turned bright red as it exploded all around Coda, sending thousands of orbs of magi streaming through the ground and up the feet of every enemy soldier on the battlefield. Each of the still attacking Estinians and the Long Whisper forces struggled in vain as they found themselves frozen by the alien energy. What is the meaning of this, Athar? Auric screamed at the top of his lungs to his ally. Coda's eyes burned an array of vivid colors and flared much like the magical flare his wolf gave off. He slowly lifted each of the captured soldiers into the air and suddenly clenched his fist. A resounding crunching sound rang through the ranks of thousands of soldiers as their bodies twisted and contorted. Athar and Auric could only watch in grotesque horror as their once overwhelming force was reduced to crumpled up corpses. Enough! Please! Coda! Marcus's terrified scream called up to the unresponsive mage. Coda's eyes sparked and sputtered out less and less magi as he reeled his fist closer to his chest, flinging both Athar and Auric closer to him until they were eye level. Do you yield? Coda growled, his voice booming a loud echo across the field. Athar and Auric looked at each other's frightened faces before stuttering a yes. In unison, The lifeless, mangled Estinian bodies fell to the ground like a heavy rain. Koda stumbled forward as his eyes returned to normal before he collapsed in complete exhaustion. Chapter 76. Koda was groggy when he finally woke. His mouth was parched and his body was still very weak. Propping himself up in the grand bed was out of the question, so he simply turned his head to view his surroundings. The room was rather large. Sunlight drifted through the windows, giving the silk curtains a soft glow. The room looked eerily similar to his own bedroom back in Long Whisper. It was beautifully furnished, with a rosewood writing desk and wardrobe. A small round table accented the center of the room with 3 comfortable chairs placed around it. In a chair next to his bed, he found King Dallin looking curiously at him.
Well, welcome back to the world of the living, Koda,
said Dallin, with a light chuckle escaping him. A blinding pain spurted from his forehead, making Koda wince.
Oh, it doesn't feel that way. How long have I been out?
Dallin stood up, stretching his back. About a week, maybe more. As you can see, you're in Vara City. There's much for you to... Koda rapidly spat out a succession of questions that nearly bowled Dallin over.
What of Auric? Is the war over? What will happen to Long Whisper now that Athar is king?
Easy, Koda. You're far too weak to deal with Long Whisper's troubles at this time. Just know that Athar and the 5 traitorous lords are in my prison.
Well, what of Auric?
Auric is also locked up, and we are currently working with Queen Natal on an agreement for his release in exchange for their surrender to Varus. Koda sighed with the relief. The war was finally over. With much of that stress having now passed, he found himself sleeping once more. Another week had passed. Koda stood beside the throne of Dallin, leaning on a crutch. He was still weak, but no longer bedridden. It was time to address the future of Long Whisper. He looked at Cass, who was on the opposite side of the throne. She was loyal and fierce. She stood by his side throughout the war. Perhaps she was even more fit than he to lead Long Whisper. Another question to add to the pile in his mind. You 6 stand before us committing the crime of treason during a time of war. What say you? Barked Dallin at the chained-up King Athar and his 5 shackled lords. Athar wrestled with his shackles, still astonished that he was in such a dire situation. When he convinced the other lords to betray the young Dawn-Edge king, he thought things were finally going his way. He was promised more power and riches than he could ever dream of when Auric Stein showered him with dreams of victory. Now, he was locked with iron bolts in front of the wretched human Everett Dallin. To throw salt on his already deep wounds, Koda may well be the one deciding his fate. The boy that he so easily manipulated, the boy whom he regarded as nothing more than a fool, was now the single greatest threat to his life.
I am king of Long Whisper, by right of the 8 tribes. Release me, and I will forget this incident.
Athar snarled in humiliation and rage. You dare call yourself the king of Long Whisper? I should hang you by your slimy neck right now. You betrayed our alliance at the most vulnerable time. Dallin spat before turning his attention to the cringing lords. You 5, do you still see this man as your king? Speak wisely or share his fate. Athar attempted to step forward, but the guards at his sides raised their pikes to his neck. He shouted from behind the spear tips instead. What kind of choice is this? You dare bully my brethren into insulting their crown? Dallin stood, shouting at the top of his lungs. His booming voice echoed off the walls of the throne room. Silence! Which of you stand by the side of the true heir of Long Whisper, Koda Dawn-Edge, and which of you stands by the side of Athar Moonfall? The 5 lords stepped forward away from Athar, their heads lowered in fear and shame. Koda looked on with sunken eyes, still drained from his overuse of the Magi. The sounds of the throne room were muffled as memories of the past war drowned his thoughts. Only fragments of those thoughts breached the surface of his mind. Thoughts of his lords betraying him. The same families that swore allegiance to his father were so quick to turn on him. They would rather side with a tyrant that would enslave his own people than fight alongside their rightful king. How could he trust these lords? He couldn't. That was the answer. These 5 lords, muttered Koda, half dazed. Dallin and Cass turned to the drowsy Koda. These 5 lords do not deserve amnesty. Cass Baneberry gawked at Coda's words.
Coda, they have distanced themselves from Athar.
Coda drooped his head and took a large breath.
They are just as guilty as Athar. They betrayed Varys and Long Whisper in a time of war. They committed treason. They must be punished. You are still weary from the battle. You are not thinking straight, Cass said, attempting to quell Coda's wrath. She walked over to him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder.
Coda jolted his shoulder away and hobbled over to the five lords, each watching with an intense fear.
How dare you treat me as some child? My innocence died when I watched my father's head roll at my feet. My foolishness died when I watched my men starve in the blasted forest. Today I am a man, and today I must no longer be weak-minded. You say I am not thinking straight? I have never thought so clearly in my life. These five lords will swing beside their beloved king. If they wish to follow him in war, then they can follow him to death.
Cass stepped back to her place as Dallin stood from his throne. Coda is the rightful king. His word is law.
Athar's eyes brimmed with fury as he began to spit words. You think you are no longer a child. You think wearing that crown hides your failures from your people. You do not deserve.
Coda thrust his hand forward, silencing Athar. The shackled elf froze, still struggling against the painful grip of the Magi's binding.
This is how you handle criticism? Stuttered Athar.
Be quiet, worm. Coda snapped ruthlessly. He released Athar from his ethereal grip, dropping the prisoner to his knees. King Dallin waved his hand to send the 6 elves back to their cells. You will all be hung in the morning. May Alana have mercy on your souls.
It is more than they deserve, whispered Coda.
Chapter 77. The Varys City Infirmary was a large building with multiple floors and several rooms, each filled to the brim with soldiers recovering from wounds inflicted during the war. The small group of Arrow members jumped onto the small medical bed, rudely awakening an injured Blavar. He groaned as he gripped his fresh bandaged side. Sitting up gingerly, and after his initial grumpiness, he found himself excited to see his visitors.
Glad to see some pretty faces. The only company I've had was a nurse and my neighbor's ugly mug.
Everyone looked to see that Rith was on the bed next to Blavar. Rith put down the book he was reading, puckered his lips, and blew Blavar a teasing kiss. Now you know you can't get enough of me. Blavar chuckled and turned back to his friends.
I'm ready to get back out there. Being laid up in this bed is driving me crazy.
Lear gave a sour look.
This Yakati wish he had been laid up in a bed and not in a cold forest bleeding out.
Some guys have all the luck, eh, Lear? Joked Blavar. Essie moved to Blavar's wounded side and gently undid the bandage to inspect the healing wound.
He's pretty good stitching. That must have been a pretty big slash.
Yeah, it was a big sword, added Blavar, widening his arms to show how big the sword actually was, perhaps indulging a bit.
Blister cloth is too small for that one, but the stitches seem to be doing just fine. Your wound will heal just in time.
Blavar arched an eyebrow inquisitively.
Just in time for what?
Ruland spoke in a low voice that only trained ears could hear.
Elhokar wants to strike back at the Black Rabbits as soon as we get back.
The compound? Gasped Blavar.
It's time we finish them while they can't recruit.
Blavar flashed a smile.
Then let's end it.
Chapter 78. Wicker stood in the dank and dimly lit prison cell. Shadows danced around the cells from the torches that hung on the walls. He jeered through the bars at an unmasked inlay who sat alone in his cell. His healing arm was still wrapped in a bandage and resting in a wool sling.
You will finally hang for the crimes you have committed, sneered Wicker.
He glared with venom across his face. Inlay turned to look up at the former White Cloak.
I will hang, but it's because I killed your brother, isn't it? You seek vengeance. It was never about justice. The whole reason why you became a Red Rabbit was to kill me.
He ended with a nasty smile. Wicker grabbed the bars in anger.
Do not play your mind games with me, Rabbit, he howled, his face flushed with rage.
He first planned to approach Inlay to find some closure, but he thought he'd have more control over his emotions. He seemed to underestimate Inlay's cunning. He seemed to always underestimate the black rabbits, a mistake that had constantly haunted him. Inlay ran back to the bars and placed his face as close to Wicker's as the bars would allow. He chomped his teeth with a crude smile that made Wicker back up. You play mind games with yourself, dear friend. A game you already lost when you buried your brother. Wicker fumed as he opened the cell and entered. He savagely backhanded Inlay against the wall and thrust out his hand to choke the rabbit. Wicker tightened his grip as Inlay gasped for any air that he could. I will end your pathetic life here and now, Wicker shouted. Inlay's eyes cracked red as he let Wicker squeeze his throat. It feels good to give in to your emotions, doesn't it? Inlay croaked. Wicker's eyes widened, and he released his grip. Inlay collapsed, coughing and sucking in air. He lifted his chin to look up. Although his face was always a light gray complexion, he was slightly paler now. His neck began to bruise with a bluish-purple color. Inlay smiled a maddened smile. Finish it, Cloak. Take your vengeance. Avenge him. Avenge your brother, Cloak. Wicker looked at his trembling hands and stepped backwards. He shook his head, whispering to himself. No, I mustn't be blinded by my hatred. This isn't what Avon wanted. Inlay snatched Wicker's wrist and pulled it to his neck. Finish it. Wicker pulled his hand away and swiftly left the cell after locking it back up. Inlay laughed loudly as Wicker made his exit. See you around, Wicker. Chapter 79. The town square of Vara City was bustling like a festival. Traders peddled balloons and roasted snacks. Clowns and jugglers entertained on the sides of the streets. Minstrels sang jingles of silly tales in an upbeat tune. Peasants crowded around a large wooden platform with the long whisper lords and Inlay Ebonpath standing on top of it. Their necks were inside nooses, preparing to be hung. Off to the side, on top of a stone second platform, sat King Coda and King Dallin on their respective leather-bound thrones. Dallin calmed down the excitement of the crowd with a raised hand before calling out to the 6 lords. Any last words? Athar's face was pale with fright. He pleaded to Coda to listen to him. My king, I regret how I wronged you. Please show mercy. Dallin leaned his chin on his hand. What say you, friend? Will you show mercy to these criminals? Coda stood so all could see him. When Raijin Leafsong attempted to assassinate my father, my kind and just father spared the Leafsong tribe from the same fate their kin shared. I won't be so foolish. Your families will be stripped of their lands, their wealth, and titles. They will be exiled from our country, and I will find new lords to take their place. Consider that my mercy. The former lords gasped as a trapdoor fell beneath them and the rope snapped taut. The gallows creaked as the 6 elves hanged dead from their nooses. Dallin looked at Inlay, repeating the same question to him. Inlay Ebonpath, any last words? Inlay's face held still and cold. He showed no fear or any emotion at all. My final words are for Alucard Freewind. Dallin looked down at Alucard and nodded, giving permission to walk up the steps to the gallows. Alucard ascended the wooden steps. He paused for a brief second to watch the swaying bodies of the former noblemen before coming face to face with his student. Several years had passed since he considered the young Shadow Elf as an ally and a friend. Perhaps even more than a friend. Had his life not turned into a mess, he could have been happy. Happy with Inlay, Jeddah, and his world within the Black Rabbits. But life has a funny way of pulling you away from the comfort of your happiness and burying it under pain and suffering. For when you survive what life throws at you, you become a stronger person. What do you have to say, Inlay? Alucard asked Inlay. At first, Alucard made no effort to make eye contact with Inlay. It wasn't shame nor hate. He dared not look at a former life when he secretly longed for it. Inlay gave a meek smile. I was once masked, but no longer am. I think it would be fair to stand on equal footing. The words were familiar to Alucard. Alucard finally glared with his cold magenta eyes into Inlay's. He was not playing any games with Inlay. Please, master. Alucard gave a long sigh, then lowered his mask and removed his hood. Inlay smiled again, looking lazily at Ellicard's features. He was now older and more refined, but Inlay still found him the handsome elf he had fallen in love with. Is that all, Inlay? Ellicard asked, impatiently. A final request? Whispered Inlay. What is it? Inlay leaned into Ellicard. The rope around his neck tugged, but he was as close as he needed to be. Inlay brushed his lips against Ellicard's and kissed him. At that moment, for those few fleeting seconds, Inlay was at peace. Even among the chaos of war, and despite the hatred carved into his heart, he still had feelings for his master. Ellicard closed his eyes and remembered a simpler time as a black rabbit, and then pushed away those memories as he pushed away Inlay. Goodbye, Inlay. The trapdoor fell beneath Inlay's feet. But before the rope could go tight, a dagger whizzed past Ellicard and severed the rope. Inlay fell underneath the platform in complete shock. A strangely cloaked figure grabbed him, and together they snuck into the shadows as if they were being transported through a void. The town square was in complete disarray. Dallin and Coda barked orders to the guards to find and recapture Inlay. Ellicard stood in silence, locked in a stupor as memories of being a rabbit clashed with part of being Arrow. He would have his vengeance, whether Inlay lived or died. He knew it was all coming to a close. Miles from Varus City, within a lush forest, a shadow seeped from the ground, growing rapidly until its darkness overtook the surrounding area. From that shadow, two figures formed from ashes. Inlay was still collapsed on his knees, his arms bound tightly to his sides. The remains of a noose hung limp around his neck. The stranger cut his bindings and threw the noose to the side. He helped Inlay stand up before lowering his hood and unraveling a black scarf from his face. It was Calsoon. Inlay stumbled backwards in bewilderment. You're one of Ellicard's red rabbits. I recognized you from the night in the forest when I tried to assassinate Coda. Calsoon bowed gracefully. At your service, Inlay. Inlay stepped closer, looking at the shadows that webbed around the forest, almost choking it. You are no normal elf. Calsoon raised his hand to cover his face, then moved it away to reveal a new scaly black face. Straight black horns protruded out of his head, slightly curved toward the tips. His eyes were the color of burning amber instead of his normal icy blue. He grinned, exposing deadly pointy teeth. His hands were now sharp claws, and he had a thin, long, barbed tail. You're a demon, Inlay exclaimed. He had heard old wives' tales of demons taking the form of others to spy on men from the bards of his troop. However, they were just that, old wives' tales. Inlay was still taken back from the reveal. He collected his wits. Why did you rescue me? Calsoon licked his fangs before speaking. This world that we live in is a complex chess game. You and everyone you know are the pieces. Inlay squinted his eyes, carefully choosing his next question. This demon spoke in riddles, but if he asked the correct questions, he would see the answer. Then who are the players? Calsoon let out a cackle. Ah, yes. A fine question, my friend. Come with me and find out for yourself. Chapter 80. Snow gently drifted in the cool night as lofty clouds roamed across the skies. Shafts of silver moonlight barely lit the Black Rabbit compound as the watchers slid past the gates, one by one. Within the frigid snows, the Arrow members strangled sentries with thin stretches of garrote wire and dragged the bodies into the woods. The snow was still light on the ground, with little chance of making noticeable tracks. The Watchers were well-trained assassins, and the Varisian War gave them the experience with rabbits that no training could have provided. At the center of the compound, the Watchers gathered in a circle, each member keeping a sharp eye out for additional rabbits. As they kept their wits heightened, the Silent Master's corridor door slid open. The Silent Master approached the center of the grounds. Scars crisscrossed his imposing frame. His tattoos seemed to ripple as he moved forward. He wore only a long, dark leather kilt. His right hand was no more than a bandaged stump, a memento from his prior encounter with Ellicard. Veins raised and pulsed down his left arm and over his only hand. By his side was a solemn-looking legion. Ellicard stared at the pair, raising his sword in caution. This is the end of the Black Rabbits, Raijin. A vile sneer lurked upon the Silent Master's face.
Legion, it is time you dealt with your whelp.
Legion stepped between his master and his student, drawing the long and heavy claymore in his single hand. The watchers immediately surrounded the two black rabbits. Legion turned his head to look at each watcher before turning his eyes back onto Ellicard.
Withdraw your men. They don't have to die tonight.
Wicker shuffled himself closer to the Silent Master. Ellicard, we'll hand it the Silent Master. You deal with your old master.
Be careful. I maimed him, but he's still deadly,
Ellicard said, nodding in acknowledgement to Wicker. Legion took in a long breath.
I want you to know that I'm sorry it has come to this. You were never meant to be my enemy.
Somehow I believe you. But it's too late for apologies now, Master. Ellicard said softly. He gripped his blade's handle tightly before lunging forward at Legion. Legion shook his head and spun quickly to land a back kick into Ellicard's chest, launching him backwards. Legion ran headlong, twirling his large sword in his hand before dropping the edge in a chopping swing. Ellicard held up his sword horizontally, watching sparks burst as the blades clashed together. Inching his arms upwards, Ellicard struggled to push Legion's sword away from him and jump up to snap a kick under his master's jaw. Legion's head rocked backwards as he swayed sideways. Dazed, Legion bent over as Ellicard launched a flying knee into his gut. Ellicard used his momentum to twist his body upside down and land a hard kick onto the side of Legion's face. The strike threw Legion off balance, and he crashed into the stone ground. Ellicard stood over Legion's crumpled body, pointing his sword point at him. He used a foot to turn the elf over onto his back. Legion knocked the sword away, thrusting his body from the ground. He flew into his student, catching Ellicard into a headlock. Legion's fingers interlaced around the back of Ellicard's neck, and he sent a series of devastating knees slamming into Ellicard's chest and side, with the final strike causing a loud crack from Ellicard's ribs. Legion grabbed his student's hood and let loose a brutal uppercut that clasped his jaw shut and flung him into the air. Ellicard landed on his back and tumbled several feet backwards. He sluggishly picked himself up and moved his hands in front of his body, readying for another painful round of attacks. Legion picked up Ellicard's blade and wielded it alongside his own sword. He tossed a smaller blade to Ellicard and shook his head.
We can fight until the sun comes up. We can beat each other into a bloody pulp. You can kill me. I can kill you. None of it will get us closer to peace.
Ellicard caught his blade. He spun it expertly in one hand before dashing at Legion again. This is our fate, eternal damnation. Neither of us deserve peace. Ellicard slashed a succession of attacks at Legion. Half were parried to the side, while two found their marks. The swings carved into Legion's upper arm and lower side. Ellicard snarled, taking a dagger from his belt and attempting to drive it into his master's shoulder. But Legion grabbed his wrist. He spun his back into Ellicard and threw him over his shoulder. Ellicard slammed down on his backside. His dagger clattered and slid across the snowy, wet ground. He tugged his arm, but found that his wrist was still locked within Legion's grip. Legion pulled Ellicard toward him and held his neck in his forearm, choking him.
Look at them,
shouted Legion, tightening his hold and forcing Ellicard to watch the other battle unfold.
My Silent Master would destroy them, and then you. Is that what you want? How many more will suffer? How many lives will you take until your hate and anger consume your entire world?
The Silent Master sidestepped and countered as each watcher leaped and dashed at him with blades glinting in the moonlight. Timber fired several arrows from the rear. Each found their mark, burying themselves deep into the Silent Master's back. But it did not quell his fury. Instead, he shifted his attention to the Canis and dove at her. Rulan, Elisa, use your weighted chains to slow him down. Leah, Kalsoon, Essie, Bleva, attack him while he is bound, Wicker shouted, throwing out a flurry of commands. Rulan and Elisa whipped a pair of chains with heavy iron weights attached to the ends. Together, they ran circles around Raijin and tied the Silent Master's arms behind his back. They grunted as they pulled the chains tight. As soon as the Silent Master was chained, Lear dashed in to cut at the Silent Master's legs. Blavar jumped onto his back, wielding dual knives, and Kalsoon and Essie dove to impale him through the stomach. With a roar, the Silent Master flexed his muscles, popping the links of the chain until his arms were free. Wrapping the remains of the chain in his left hand, he pulled Rulan and Elisa into his awaiting arms. Elisa and Rulan flipped head over heels as they collided with his muscular right arm. Turning to Lear, he lifted his leg and nailed a solid kick into the Yakati's jaw.
Lear's eyesight lit up and then faded to a blurred darkness as he smashed down to the ground. Rocking his head back, Raijin bashed his skull into Blavar's face. Blavar's jaw snapped shut with a loud pop as the former thief reeled backwards, falling with a loud thud onto the floor. With Raijin's free hand, he thrust at Kalsoon's neck. Catching tightly, he lifted the elf up and smashed him into the ground, creating several cracks in the stone tiles. Whilst the Silent Master was distracted by Kalsoon, Essie managed to run her blade partially into Raijin. However, the large elf stiffened his abs, bending the sword until it buckled and snapped from the force. He savagely backhanded the young Windfoot into a frightened timber. Both fell backwards, rolling into a mess on the ground. The Silent Master turned to Wicker and smiled.
Your clan lacks the skill to defeat me.
Wicker shot a worried glance to Ellicard. Ellicard began to fall in and out of consciousness. His eyes rolled back into his head as Legion continued to squeeze Ellicard's neck. Ellicard gargled out a response the best he could. Just two. What was that? Ellicard grabbed onto Legion's arms and sunk a large bite into it. Legion yelped as he lunged backwards, holding onto his now bleeding arm. Just two. Ellicard wheezed. He smirked as he steadily got to his feet. He looked over his shoulders to see his watchers strewn about, barely able to keep up with the surprisingly able-bodied Raijin. I need to end this. Indeed, Legion said sternly. Both rushed at each other, swinging, clashing, and slicing. Ellicard dodged right as a heavy strike came crashing down. Thinking fast, Ellicard stomped onto the blade with one foot and jumped into the air as Legion pulled it upwards, struggling to free it from the ground. Ellicard sailed up and over Legion, plunging his sword deep into Legion's shoulder. Legion fell to his knees as his shoulder sagged, letting his arm fall limp. Ellicard painfully yanked and rested the blade against Legion's neck. I taught you well, Ellicard, Legion managed to say despite the overwhelming pain he was in. You taught me well? You taught me nothing but lies, shouted Ellicard as he swung Legion to face him. You filled my head with delusions of honor and purpose, and for what? So that I'd turn my back on the real people who cared for me. Legion looked away from Ellicard in shame. The drive to protect his clan and kill Ellicard had eroded over time. He was now just a husk of the black rabbit he once was. He wanted only to die by the hands of the last person he cared for. I taught you what I thought would keep you alive. I taught you to think and fight. I didn't want to make you the perfect weapon, but a perfect man. Legion turned to face Ellicard once more, and tears swelled in his eyes. I'm honored to say you turned out well. A good and just adult. You've grown into the leader I always hoped you'd become. You are my humanity, for I never had it on my own. I'm proud of you, my son. Ellicard brought his face closer to Legion's. You don't deserve that He couldn't finish the sentence. He clenched his teeth as the words choked in his throat. Tears formed as they dripped down his cheeks. Legion may have killed Jeddah, but he still loved him like a father. Like the father that was there for him. Like the father that raised him. Like the father that protected him. Like the father he needed. That he would always love.
You were always too weak, Legion.
Raijin's familiar low growl cut through the winter night. In his hand, he held Wicker by the face, dragging him on the ground as he walked over to Legion and Ellicard. Ellicard gently laid Legion on the ground and met Raijin halfway. You are the root of all this. You take the innocent and contort us into vile killers, bred to turn on our own world and do your bidding. You are the true reason why Jeddah is dead. You will corrupt the youth of this world no more. Wicker groaned as he was released from Raijin's clutches. Raijin grabbed Ellicard by the cloak and brought him close to his face.
I did not corrupt your mind. I merely surfaced your desires.
Ellicard squinted, holding his face slightly askew from Raijin's. What desires? Raijin flashed a nasty smile.
You desire to serve, and you desire to kill.
Ellicard let loose a blood-shivering roar as he tried to strike out at Raijin with his blade, but the Silent Master threw him aside.
Ellicard clattered onto the ground, weakened from his long battle with Legion. With his newfound rage rising, he mustered the energy to stand. Raijin barreled toward Ellicard, punishing him with a punch to his gut, following with a hefty elbow to his upper back. Ellicard lay flattened on the ground. As he struggled to stand again, Raijin smashed his foot down onto Ellicard's head. Ellicard's face bounced off the ground as blood splattered in several directions. Raijin knelt down and lifted Ellicard's bloodied face by the tuft of his hair. He sneered sadistically as he spoke lowly into the elf's ear.
You led a glorious life.
Ellicard gagged and spurted blood as he clawed at Raijin's grip.
A shame that it ended so anticlimactically.
Raijin continued.
His life isn't over yet.
Wicker's voice called out from behind Raijin. Raijin dropped Ellicard, turning around to face Wicker.
You alone will not be able to save this one.
Well, it's a good thing he didn't come alone, Blavar said, limping to Wicker's side and flipping a dagger in his hand. Raijin jeered as one by one each watcher came to Ellicard's aid.
I've already defeated you all. What makes you think you can win this time?
Arrow readied their weapons. Wicker smiled. Because now, we are whole. Raijin growled in confusion as a sword drew from his stomach, spraying a fountain of blood onto the snowy ground. Raijin spun to find an exhausted Ellicard smiling with half-slit eyes. Watchers, attack! Wicker called out as each arrow member hacked and sliced at Raijin. As if in a ballet of blood, the Watchers danced around the Silent Master as he desperately attempted to overcome the flashes of steel before finally falling to his knees. Blood flowed like several rivers from the hideous wounds all over his body. His head slouched forward as his breathing became labored. Ellicard raised Raijin's chin with the tip of his blade. The Black Rabbits are done. Raijin grinned a ghastly smile.
The Black Rabbits were but one day in an endless winter.
Ellicard snarled and ruthlessly sliced Raijin's head off. He took a great sigh. He dropped his blade and stumbled backwards. He was lightheaded from exhaustion and the loss of blood. He took a knee and whispered a low prayer. Alana, tonight I have slain a man. I have shown him no love, no remorse. Alana, take this man's soul in one hand, with the other mend my hatred's source. Finally sever our bond and give me my release, so that I can remember those I've lost in peace. Ellicard fell silent after finding his atonement, before making his way back to his resting master. Essie, can you patch him up? I'll do what I can. Ellicard cradled Legion in his arms. His nightmare was over, and all he wanted now was to dream. Dream for a time of peace, a peace to share with his new family, perhaps even to share with his old family, to share with Legion. Master, Legion winced as Essie examined Legion's gruesome wounds. You saved us all, Ellicard. Master, Ellicard started, unable to find the right words, much less the perfect words for this moment. She would be proud of you, said Legion, as he slowly fell into a slumber. Master, I forgive you. Chapter 81. In the newly refurbished Ruins Abbey, Ellicard relaxed on the floor next to Avalon as they watched the new Silent One's train under Veda's watchful eye. Ellicard stirred uncomfortably in his new finery. The waistcoat was tight around his ribs, and the fluffy ascot itched his throat. He was older now, and wanted to focus his attention on a new life instead of bloodying his hands and hunting down those responsible for his hatred. He had finally found a world of peace, and wished to hold on to it. Veda is falling in well as your first blade once again, Ellicard said as he desperately scratched at the ascot. She returned from the blade range as an iron wing, rising through the ranks faster than I ever did. She requested to serve under me, which is good, because I seem to be attached to her, Avalon explained, fondly watching her blade sister move through the kata. What of Edema? Ellicott asked, remembering the fierceness of the mysterious woman. She was assigned to me only to aid in the war and establish this new temple. Although this was once an abbey for ruins, it will now serve well for Judeo. I believe Adima is being assigned to the Holy Front. I wish her the best. It's not a pleasant assignment. Avalon took a sip of wine from the glass sitting next to her and brushed her hair away from her eye. These new Silent Ones will be the first of many generations that will be taught to fight like rabbits. We learned much from the war in Varus. To mix teachings will craft the perfect weapon for Judeo. A blade is only as sharp as the rabbit wielding it, Ellicard mused. Speaking of which, it's been almost a year since you and the rest of Arrow put down Raijin. How are things going? Avalon asked. It has, hasn't it? Despite our best efforts, Dallin has reported that new assassin clans are popping up in Varus. Black Rabbit copycats, no doubt. The Ghost Fox clan and the Twisted Skies clan. Looks like Varus will need to form an Arrow unit, Avalon said, grinning. We're already on top of that. Wicker is being sent to Varus City to start the unit. I'll be taking command of ours. Wicker off to Varus? Who will be your second in command? Lear? Blavar? Legion, actually. He picked up the military life very well. Go figure. I'll really need his help too, because Arrow has tripled in size. Several new faces came from the 12th Spearman Division alone. Will Long Whisper need Arrow to be so large? The rabbits are dead, but not finished. No doubt someone will pick up the mantle of Silent Master once again, Ellicard said grimly. Any word from Inlay? I heard rumors you were responsible for his escape. Ellicard balled his fist and grit his teeth. All the work put into gaining the trust of Long Whisper nearly decimated by the hidden stranger. No one has seen or heard from Inlay since that day. If it weren't for Coda, Dallin would have arrested me for conspiracy to commit treason. Hopefully Wicker will be able to smooth out our relationship with Varus. Well, looks like we have our work cut out for us. Ellicard stood up, quick to pat off the dust on his new clothes. We'll see. Ellicard walked down the streets of Lost Dawns. Since being promoted to captain, he had a lot more tit to burn. He had loaded his wardrobe with the latest in Long Whisper fashion and found himself filling up a newly furnished bookcase. Things in his life he once shrugged off now seemed to be coming to the forefront. He was domesticated now. The streets were becoming lively as the noon sun sat high in the sky. He stopped to look into the glass pane of a storefront. Staring at his reflection, he adjusted his green and orange waistcoat that seemed to have slightly climbed his chest while he was at the Silent One Abbey. He took a comb from his pocket and brushed his hair into a neater look. Before he had the chance to put it back into his pocket, a small boy bowled him over. Sorry, mister, the elven child said. Ellicard propped himself up and took a good look at the boy. He was around 12. Dirt covered his fair skin and messed up his stark white hair. His eyes were a vibrant green. He wore a filthy tunic and patched-up trousers. Ellicard lifted himself up and patted the dirt off his pants. Not a problem. I've had my share of bumps in the past. The boy snickered. I'm sure, mister. He made an over-the-top face as he picked up a silver trit resting on the ground. Mister, you dropped this. Ellicard smiled. No, honesty should be rewarded. You keep it. Run along now. Boy flashed an over-exaggerated smile and dashed off. Nice kid, Ellicard said to himself. He wondered exactly how many of his coins had dropped from his purse before realizing that his coin purse was missing. He frantically scanned the ground before it dawned on him that the boy had conned him. Ellicard sneered as he looked at where the child had scampered off and gave chase. Ellicard leaped onto the shoulders of several citizens before pulling himself onto the roof of a shop. He ran to the edge and looked down into an alley to see the boy counting the contents of Ellicard's purse. Hey, hand over the money and I won't hurt you, Ellicard shouted at the street urchin. The boy looked up in surprise. He tied the purse on his belt and hopped over the fence behind him. Ellicard dropped down and flipped over the fence, chasing after the thief. The boy fled, climbing a ladder to the nearest roof and leaping over wide alley gaps. He glanced behind him and found the strange nobleman had kept his pace, not tiring out from the strenuous obstacles. The boy spotted a gap ahead that this man would be mad to attempt to jump. Picking up his speed, the boy mustered all his dexterity and energy to leap across the incredibly wide berth. But despite his best efforts, he came up short. He fell inches from the target ledge and thrust out a hand in a desperate attempt to latch onto the building. There he dangled, certain death waiting for him below. An older hand grabbed the boy by his tunic and lifted him onto the safety of the building. It was the nobleman. Ellicard kept his grip tight so the boy could not escape, all the while contemplating the insane lengths the boy took to get away from him. You've got some talent, kid. That potential is going to waste out here in the roots. How would you like to work for me? The boy squirmed himself free and pouted his face. Doing what? He asked in a nasty voice. Doing the world some good. The child sneered. The world ain't done nothing for me. Alucard smirked. What's your name, kid? Kaizo. Alucard dropped down to one knee so that he was eye level with the boy. Kaizo, the world hasn't seen what you can do yet. Come under my wing, and I will give you that opportunity. Come under my wing and learn from me. Kaizo looked curiously. What will I learn? To hunt assassins. Chapter 82. The sacred isle of Nashun was not at all how Coda and Wildeye left it. The once verdant forest was now blanketed in vivid white. Withered leaves fell from the grasp of their branches and danced to the snow-covered forest floor below. Coda looked on in astonishment, as winter had found its way to Nashun for the first time. Zyle sat on a stone with a litter of wolf pups playing on his lap. Coda slowly approached his grandfather, yet Zyle did not bother looking up at his grandson he had not seen in such a long while. His voice was tired and worn, and he coughed hard in between his words.
I traveled the world as you told me to, and I found a pupil. She is an elf of Stratus descent. She is not well accustomed to warm climates, but she shows great aptitude and will to learn. Her name is Lore Starfrost. Perhaps you will become friends in time.
He gently pushed the pups away and gingerly used his staff to stand. His joints popped and he grunted and his back ached.
It seems the Dawn Edge were not meant to be guardians.
Coda rushed to support him, but was brushed away. Well, what were we meant to be? Coda asked.
Leaders,
smiled Zyle. Coda grinned, but his face turned serious. He pointed to the glistening ice that gripped the canopy above. I've never seen seasons change in Nashun. What is happening? Zyle shuffled over to pet Wildeye, who arched her back to get an extra bit of attention from the ancient elf.
Coda, I am dying. As the Arcane Guardian, my life force is connected to this forest. When I finally pass, the forest may well never come out of this winter. When that happens, evil will swallow this land whole.
What of your student? Zyle's face wrinkled.
Lore is wise beyond her years, but not ready to protect the seal.
Coda's brow perked up. Seal?
The celestial seal of Cyprus, one of 5, each one written on each of the dragon realms. They ward the gods from the mortal plane. However, if broken, the gods will continue their deity wars on our world, and Drak Terra will crumble. Even now, the seals are cracking and fading. I am too weak to repair the seals, and Lore is far from being fully trained still.
Coda shook his head. I thought the Arcane Guardian protected the Magi.
They protect all the world's secrets. The Magi is just one of them.
Why didn't you tell me about something with such dire consequences? I could have helped.
Coda fumed angrily. I was wrong to think you were prepared to become a guardian. I now know how much you latch onto the Magi, as if it's some sort of nectar. I have felt you growing darker. I only envisioned your fate as a flicker, but as time passed, Coda, I fear the worst.
Coda's face hardened like the frozen ground beneath him. Darker? Fear the worst? I have grown vastly stronger than the child I was when I left.
It's far too late to prove that yourself to me. However, it is not too late to prove yourself to those that depend on us.
Well, tell me how, grandfather.
Use your influence to find the seals and protect them. I sense I am not the only one who knows of the seals waning.
Zyle wheezed. Wild-Eye leaned her large body against the aged elf so that he could rest. Coda nodded solemnly. I will do this for you. Zyle placed a trembling hand on his grandson's shoulder.
Do this for the world.
Chapter 83. Inlay walked for what seemed like an eternity to the shadow elf. He trekked alone through a dark void. The walls were black but shimmered a magenta light, and the road was lit with a soft white glow. The path seemed to twist and rotate with each step he took. How much further? He asked, although he felt like he was talking to himself because Kalsoon seemed to have vanished months ago. Inlay had no choice but to walk down the strange corridor without the aid of his mysterious guide. He did wait at first. However, much like the journey he was on, the waiting seemed to be never-ending as well. Kalsoon's delightful voice came from behind Inlay. Well, we've just arrived, my friend. Inlay spun around, surprised by Kalsoon's sudden reappearance. Where have you been? Kalsoon grinned and bowed. 1,000 apologies, my friend, but perhaps it is best if you didn't know. Inlay narrowed his eyes. The abundance of vague puzzles was starting to wear on him. Well, how long have I been here? I mean, not to confuse you any further, but time has no meaning here. Once you leave to go back to the mortal plane, it will be as if you never left. Inlay shook his head in disbelief before asking one final question. Where is here, exactly? Just as the question left to escape his mouth, the world around them warped and vanished. Around them appeared a large room with a circular table at the center. At the table sat 5 men and a woman. Each one wore a long black cloak and an oversized hood that masked their face. The table was made of dark ebonwood with a large, black, 8-pointed snowflake carved into the table. The carving was outlined with a thin line of silver paint so that the black design would better be seen on the dark-colored wood. In the foreground of the snowflake were 2 crescent moons, painted blue, that faced away from one another. Circling the room were stone walls and invisible pillars that took the form of falling snow. There were 2 empty seats, one in which Kalsoon sat. Inlay looked around confused. He stood silently, waiting for an explanation before finally speaking. Are you the players of this game? Kalsoon clapped his hands in delight. A man next to him rose from his seat and unveiled his face. He was a devilishly handsome man with delicate features and faintly silver eyes. His skin was pale and matched his short platinum hair. He spoke with an elegant dialect, as if he were highly educated and had noble blood. Welcome, Inlay, to the Dead of Winter, a collection of unique individuals such as yourself. Inlay was even more confused. How did you know my name? We always keep an eye on those we take a special interest in. Who are you? Inlay asked. A whole batch of new questions hatched in his mind. The mysterious gentleman bowed. I am known as Raislin to my peers. However, others know me as other names. I will introduce the other members of our guild, but over time you must take it upon yourself to learn each of their strengths. He moved his hand to each of the 6 other members. As he stated their names, they stood and bowed. Uther, Azrin, Strife, the Collector, Sable, and you have already met Kalsoon, who serves as Sable's servant. Inlay nodded to each, but looked blankly at the 8th seat. Who sits in the last seat? Raislin walked over to the empty chair and rested his hands on its back. His name was Raijin Leafsong. I believe you knew him? Inlay looked flabbergasted. The Silent Master was one of your members? He was merely a Leafsong. Who do you think trained him? We all assumed that it was one of the warrior tribes who disapproved of the founding of Lost Dawns, Inlay responded. Kalsoon snickered out loud. We trained him, we set up his funds, and we gave him his opportunity for the vengeance he craved against the Dawn Edge. Inlay shook his head in confusion. The Black Rabbits were all part of your game? Kalsoon strolled over to comfort Inlay. My friend, I told you that you and everyone you know are just pieces in our game. Inlay pushed him away. Why? Why go to such lengths? Raislin flashed a wide smile. Now we are getting to the good questions. By straining Jalen's power, we knew he would send for Coda to come home. By further pressuring Coda, he would become king. Inlay furrowed his brow. How does Coda becoming king have anything to do with this? You see, without Coda in the Shun, a new arcane guardian couldn't be trained. Soon the seals will be ready for us to make our move. Inlay leaned against the wall. I still don't understand. But you will in time, Kalsoon finished. Raislin motioned to the 8th chair. Take a seat, Inlay. A new silent master must be named. Inlay grinned and slowly stepped toward the seat, but halted shy of sitting down. I wish to be a player, not a pawn. We knew you were more ambitious than Raijin. That is why we sought you out, Kalsoon said, giving a cunning smile. Then I will join and become the new silent master, Inlay answered as he finally took the 8th seat. To the dawning of a new season, darker than the last, Raislin toasted. A pleased look was strewn across his face.